Hello, am I still plugged in or not?
You're still in, Commissioner Cohen.
The broadcast of the Minneapolis Charter Commission meeting will now begin.
Good afternoon. Welcome to this live broadcast of our virtual meeting, the regular July meeting of the Minneapolis Charter Commission. This meeting includes the remote participation of members as authorized under Minnesota statute section 13D.021 due to the declared local health pandemic. My name is Barry Clegg and I'm the chair of the Charter Commission. I'll now call this meeting to order and ask the clerk to call the roll so that we may verify the presence of a quorum.
Commissioner Abbott.
Here.
Commissioner Cohen.
Here.
Commissioner Garcia. Commissioner Ginder.
Here.
Commissioner Giroux-Isaacson.
Here.
Commissioner Kozak.
Here.
Commissioner Lickness. Commissioner Metke.
Here.
Commissioner Newborn.
Here.
Commissioner Perry.
Here.
Commissioner Rubenstein.
Here.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Here.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Present.
Commissioner Smith.
Here.
Commissioner Garcia. Commissioner Lickness. Chair Clegg.
Here.
There are 13 members present.
We have a quorum. We'll now proceed to our agenda, a copy of which was posted for public access to the city's Legislative Information Management System, which is available at lims.minneapolismn.gov. The agenda is before us. I would also like to add to the agenda receipt and filing of substitute amendments proposed by Commissioners Abbott and Giroux-Isaacson. That's two separate amendments. And I'll put that right after the chair's report, if that's okay with everybody. Can I have a motion to approve the agenda as amended?
So moved. Sandberg.
Second, Schwarzkopf.
Is there any discussion? If not, will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Abbott.
Aye.
Commissioner Cohen.
Aye.
Commissioner Garcia. Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Giroux-Isaacson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kozak.
Aye.
Commissioner Lickness. Commissioner Metke.
Aye.
Commissioner Newborn.
Aye.
Commissioner Perry.
Aye.
Commissioner Rubenstein.
Aye.
Commissioner Sandberg.
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf.
Aye.
Commissioner Smith.
Aye.
Commissioner Garcia. Commissioner Lickness. Chair Clegg.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes.
Thank you. The agenda is approved. Next item is the acceptance of the minutes from both the June 3rd regular meeting and the July 1st special meeting held a week ago today. Is there a motion to approve the minutes?
So moved, Mitchie. Second, Sandberg.
We have the motion before us. Is there any discussion or corrections to the minutes? Seeing none, will the clerk please call the roll?
Commissioner Abbott.
Aye.
Commissioner Cohen.
Aye.
Commissioner Garcia. Commissioner Ginder.
Aye.
Commissioner Giroux-Isaacson.
Aye.
Commissioner Kozak.
Aye.
Commissioner Lickness. Commissioner Metke,
Aye.
Commissioner Newborn,
Aye.
Commissioner Perry,
Aye.
Commissioner Rubenstein,
Aye.
Commissioner Sandberg,
Aye.
Commissioner Schwarzkopf,
Aye.
Commissioner Smith,
Aye.
Commissioner Garcia, Commissioner Lickness, Chair Clegg.
Aye.
There are 13 ayes.
The minutes are approved. Next item on the agenda is the chair's report, and I don't have anything to report today that's not otherwise on our agenda. Next item is the one we just added, and that is to hear from both Commissioner Abbott and Commissioner Giroux Isaacson. I told them they could each have a few minutes to introduce their proposed substitute amendments. So I'll let Commissioner Abbott go first. Commissioner?
Yes, thank you, Mr. Chair. I think the body is obligated to move as quickly as it can to meet this August 5th deadline. And in the spirit of approaching this, the question is not, how do we address this? I think the question is, how do we make this better? The proposal that we've gotten from the council, there are certainly different ways to approach the problem. And kind of in the spirit of promoting discussion about alternatives and trying to address some of the public comments that we've all gotten over the last week or so, I decided to introduce a substitute amendment that I submitted to the clerk last week. My amendment gives the council the explicit authority to conduct a pilot project in part of the city in which it could adopt the new procedures and department that it has proposed in the main amendment. The difference between the council proposal and my proposal, of course, is that my proposal does not lock the city in to the results of any particular proposal. What I propose is that for 2 years, the city adopt this pilot project, and at the end of 2 years, the city can decide whether or not it has generated enough information in order to fully commit to the alternative, whether or not, for example, in the old situation outside the pilot project, enough improvements have been made to consider that. And my concept is, although I didn't include it in the specific text of my amendment, my concept is at the end of the pilot project, we would revisit this charter referendum and have the public vote either to adopt the new proposals or not, having been, I think, much more fully informed about the situation. The proposals that come over from the council, I think, are quite startling. They may be necessary. I think everybody can agree that significant structural change is necessary in the way that we operate public safety here. And there's also, I think, no reasonable disagreement that we are in a crisis and that the public should have some voice in how we shape our response to that crisis. That voice should be expressed as soon as possible, which of course is the general election coming up this November. I think the question is, how can we make whatever proposals we have the best available option for the residents? There's been a lot of talk about the lack of evidence in terms of the alternative and how effective it is. I mean, it is a really radical concept. I mean, although the the council proposal doesn't necessarily require abolishing the police. I think that's more rhetoric than reality. It is true that the approach would be very different from anything that's been done before, and I'm getting a lot of emails from people who are genuinely quite concerned about what the world will look like in if this council proposal is adopted. The issue I have is if you adopt the council proposal, in order to fix it, you end up having to amend the charter again. And of course, amending the charter is a very difficult proposition. We could be stuck with this for a while. I think even the advocates of very radical concepts would agree that we're going to have to do some mid-course corrections here, given the kind of uncharted territory that we're plowing. So I've just, mostly for purposes of discussion, but I also think it gives us some flexibility. I propose an idea of like, well, let's take a two-track strategy. Let's get a pilot project up and running. Let's gather some data on what the new system looks like. And when the public starts asking questions about how much does it cost, how many of these new public safety officers are going to be hired, how are we going to cover 911 calls, all the nuts and bolts practicality, I think that people are really entitled to get answers on. We will have some data to give to them to kind of assure them that public safety is still a priority. What I've done is added a new article to the charter that basically authorizes the pilot project. Section 10.1 of my amendment gives the council the authority to do so. I've established some criteria for what the pilot project would look like. I'm certainly open to suggestions on better timing or better parameters. I'm certainly not wedded to any concept here. I think the critical idea is, and I think the critical element of any charter amendment is to give the council the legislative authority to adopt rules and regulations for how law enforcement is to be conducted in the city. That's why I also added section 10.2, which gives the council the legislative authority inside the pilot project to do that. My proposal differs a little bit from the council in the sense that I think we have a separation of powers problem. The current situation is the mayor has both the legislative and executive authority over the police. The mayor gets to set both the rules and gets to enforce the rules as he or she might see fit. I think that that obviously creates a separation of powers problem, as in there isn't any separation of powers. There's no ability for another branch of government to check what the mayor does with the police. The council proposal is essentially the exact mirror image of that, only on the council side. In other words, the council under their proposal gets all the executive power and all the legislative power, and it eliminates the ability of the mayor to check any kind of use or abuse of that power by the council. I think both alternatives, both of those alternatives, I think, have kind of the same flaw to them. So I've drafted 10.2, which gives legislative authority to the council, but which gives executive authority over law enforcement to the mayor. Of course, it obligates the mayor to enforce the rules as adopted by the council.
Thank you, Commissioner. Could you wrap up?
Sure. I would just say that the 10.2 is kind of inspired by the proposal that Councilmember Gordon made 2 years ago, and I really do think the separation of powers issue, along with the delegation of legislative authority to the council, are the key issues that we have to address as we work through these issues before August 5th. And that my proposal is designed to produce that discussion. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Abbott. Next, I'll ask that we hear from Commissioner Giroux Isaacson, who has a separate substitute amendment. Commissioner Giroux Isaacson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. My substitute amendment is in an effort to find some middle ground and compromise that I think would gain a positive vote in November or next year. My proposal would create 2 new charter departments: the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention and a law enforcement department. The 2 departments, the Department of Community Safety and Violence Prevention, I pretty much carry over most of the City Council's language, except I add that the responsibility for this department will be non-law enforcement public safety services. The second department is the Department of Law Enforcement Services, and kept pretty much the same language we have currently in the charter with regards to the police. This would be the Department of Law Enforcement Services. I did add some powers to the Civilian Police Conduct Oversight Commission, where they would have approval process for any of the mayor's rules or regulations that the mayor wants to propose for the law enforcement division or services department. I have changed the funding requirements to half of what it's currently at for law enforcement licensed police officers. And I've added a director of law enforcement services that would be the chief law enforcement officer of the city and would report to the mayor. And this process of nominating or hiring someone would include a consultation to the Civilian Police Conduct Oversight Commission. I am also open to any edits or changes, and I hope that the council members who are listening will give us some feedback first, if even they're open to any alternative language. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Thank you, Commissioner. Without objection, the clerk will receive and file the 2 proposed substitute motions, and they'll be forwarded to the amendment work group for further review. Next item is receiving and filing reports of the redistricting work groups. This is not the proposed amendment. This is the redistricting that occurs after every census in Minneapolis, and we are preparing for that redistricting now, even though it will not occur until 2022. So I'd like to hear from the redistricting rules work group. Either one of the co-chairs, whoever can give a 2-minute summary, that would be great.
Hi, this is Commissioner Perry. I think I'm going to do that since Commissioner Rubenstein has her hands full with another work group. So we met on June 25th. That was our first meeting. We have 2 work products. One is an updated rules document, and the second is an updated procedures document. For our timeline at our last work group meeting, and we put together a timeline where we would first do the rules update, which we did, and then secondly we would look at the procedures document. It turns out there's a lot of overlap between the advisory member selection work group outcomes and the rules work group outcomes. So we are looking to have a joint meeting sometime in perhaps August or September, depending on how other things go for timing purposes. And then we would clean up any drafts in October, and then have our work presented at our November 4th meeting of the full Charter Commission. A quick update just on the update on what we did with the rules document. It turns out that we all felt that the way the process worked in 2012 was a good one, and we did not feel we needed to make wholesale changes, but we did need to make some updates to the current rules document, and they include typos. We removed reference to an operations committee that doesn't make sense anymore. We tightened up some corner cases, and we addressed communication in the pandemic era. And finally, we gave weight to two-way communication during this process. So those are the kinds of changes that we made to the Rules Committee. What I envision seeing happening, and I certainly will defer to Commissioner Rubenstein on this as well, is that we update these and then present them at our November 4th meeting for adoption by the full commission. That's my status update.
Thank you, Commissioner Perry. Next item is the update from the Redistricting Advisory Member Selection Work Group. Which co-chair is going to be taking that one?
Mr. Chair, this is Jerome Isaacson. I believe Commissioner Garcia has that.
I was just going to offer.
Can you hear me?
There she is.
Oh, thank goodness. Whew. Thank you. We met on June 30th, and we discussed our overall goals and purposes. Excuse me. And then we talked about 4 documents that were from the last cycle, which is the job description for the advisory group, the application to be on the advisory group, the rules or guidelines, and redistricting process as a whole, as well as some FAQs. And we went through the various documents briefly, discussed a couple of main changes to the application off the bat. One is to clarify that application does not imply appointment in any way. And secondly, that election judges are able to apply this cycle. Last time they were considered city employees, and that has now been changed. As we talked, the city clerk mentioned that there is an interdisciplinary group of city staff who are available to assist us and have some suggestions on revising these documents to make the most, just to improve them and make them more applicable to the time we live in now. So our work group is going to meet with them later this month and talk through kind of what they suggest, and then any other revisions or changes we would like to make to this document, we will make and put forth to the Charter Commission to recommend and adopt. And that meeting where we will invite city staff is July 21st. And in addition, the city clerk's office is revising the timeline, the calendar for redistricting, and we will then update a timeline and work plan for our work group in accordance with those revisions. And I believe that's it.
Thank you, Commissioner. Next and last is the Redistricting Outreach and Communications Work Group. That would be Commissioner Newborn or Sandberg.
Yes, this is Commissioner Sandberg. If it's okay with Commissioner Newborn, I can sort of update you. You have the report in front of you that came from our committee, our work group meeting. In addition, Commissioner Sandberg, Commissioner Newborn and I met last Monday, and the reason for that is that she was elected co-chair of the work group. So there'll be two of us still. And we have some issues that we need to have resolved before we can finalize our work plan and timeline. Specifically, we need to figure out the calendar, although it sounds like that's in process. That would be very helpful. And then we need to set up a joint meeting with Commissioners Garcia and Giroux-Isaacson so we can clarify for certain what the different areas of responsibility are. It was not clear to us if we were supposed to be working on outreach issues for selection for the advisory group or not. And as soon as we can make sure we know what's going on with that, we will be able to finalize a work plan, finalize a calendar, and get it to you within the next 2 months. I'm not going to guarantee it's going to be next month, but we'll see. We need to meet with the committee again, obviously. And that's all I have. Commissioner Newborn may have other things to add.
Commissioner Sandberg, I think you did a great job of giving an overview of what our next steps are and our intentions to meet with our other colleagues. Thank you for providing that update.
Oh, and one last thing I forgot. Commissioner Newborn kindly accepted responsibility for leading our outreach efforts, and I will kind of hang around and deal with documents and so forth. We thought it made sense to kind of divide up, and then we'll work with the committee to figure out how they want to align with one part or the other. And that's it.
Thank you, Commissioner. So without objection, those three reports are received and filed. Our main item on the agenda tonight is hearing from our visitors from the City Council. I believe we have Council President Bender, Council Member Ellison, and Council Member Fletcher. Those are the only ones I heard at the beginning of the meeting. Are there any others joining us today?
Gordon is here.
Council Member Gordon is here as well.
I am also here. Council Member Cano.
Council Member Cano, thank you. We'll hear from the council first with a brief introduction and overview of the proposed amendment. 10 minutes tops, please. You can divide up the time as you choose to among yourselves. Then we'll have questions from charter commissioners. Charter commissioners tend to give speeches when they ask questions, so questions can be up to 1 minute in length and no speeches. Then we'll have 3 minutes for council members to answer. Again, you can divide it up any way you wish. The first few questions were developed by the Amendment Work Group, which is chaired by Commissioner Rubenstein. So I'll ask her to ask those questions. Then we'll have time for questions from individual commissioners. Council members, please go ahead for your introduction.
Thank you, Chair Clegg. I'm Lisa Bender. I'm the president of the Minneapolis City Council, and I represent Ward 10 on the City Council. So I'm here with my colleagues who are authors of the Charter Amendment, which the City Council unanimously forwarded to this body, the Charter Commission, on June 26th. The proposed Charter Amendment would create a new charter department focused on community safety and violence prevention, remove the police department as a separate charter department, and remove the provision added to the charter in 1961 that requires a police force of 0.0017 employees per resident. Before I turn it over to my colleagues to speak more specifically about the Charter Amendment, I wanted to level set and reiterate what Chair Clegg said at your last meeting, particularly for the public, about the roles of the City Council and the Charter Commission in this process of putting an issue to the voters of Minneapolis. In Minneapolis, each City Council member is elected to represent a specific ward for a 4-year term, and that election last took place in 2017. The Charter Commission is established pursuant to Minnesota Statute 410.05, and its members are appointed by the District Court acting through its Chief Judge. Under Minnesota Statute 410.12 Subdivision 5, the council of any city having a home rule charter may propose charter amendments to the voters by ordinance. Any ordinance proposing such an amendment would be submitted to the Charter Commission, and then within 60 days thereafter, the Charter Commission shall review the proposed amendment, and they may add an additional 90 days by filing with the city clerk a resolution determining that additional time for review is needed. So after reviewing that proposed amendment, the Charter Commission would approve or reject the proposed amendment or substitute or suggest a substitute amendment like the ones that were described earlier. And so that gives us 3 options from the Charter Commission to come back to the City Council, either to suggest approving the City Council proposal, rejecting the proposal, or offering an alternative language. And in any of those scenarios, the City Council can still choose to put the charter language on the ballot to the voters. As you all know, we are in the midst of a global pandemic and an economic crisis, both of which are disproportionately impacting our neighbors of color. On May 25th, 4 members of the Minneapolis Police Department answered a 911 call that resulted in George Floyd being restrained for 8 minutes and 46 seconds while he called out that he could not breathe. George Floyd's death at the hands of the Minneapolis Police Department is but one of several recent police-involved deaths, which are very costly to the city, both financially and in the trauma that they cause in our community. The city is currently responding to hundreds of complaints of police behavior during the protests that followed, and is cooperating with legal action initiated against the Minneapolis Police Department by the Minnesota Department of Human Rights to investigate patterns of racial discrimination in the department. In the wake of George Floyd's death, we received an unprecedented number of contacts from our constituents, calling on us to not only address specific issues within the police department, but to take a wholly different approach to public safety. All 12 members of the City Council unanimously supported a resolution committing the city to taking a holistic approach to public safety and outlining a process for community engagement. And all 12 members of the City Council unanimously forwarded the charter amendment to this body as one part of that work. My colleagues will speak more about some of the work upon which the proposed charter amendment rests and how it fits into the broader work to address racial inequity in every aspect of our city's work that the council has undertaken in recent years. We appreciate the balance you are seeking to strike between deliberative process and meeting the deadline for submitting one of the 3 choices back to the City Council in time for the November 2020 election. We ask that within this you weigh, above all, the right of our residents to weigh in on this issue at this time. With that, I'll turn it over to Councilmember Fletcher.
Thank you, Council President, and thank you, Chair Clegg, for the opportunity to speak. I'm Steve Fletcher, the council member for Ward 3. I'm one of the co-authors. I wanted to give a little bit of context about what we've been doing in the lead up to this, both to describe what brought us to the place where we think such an action is called for and justified and is the right course of action, and also what kind of planning and community input has gone in to consideration of this work. So first, I'll note that we have a long track record of implementing reforms, the policies and strategies deployed by the mayor and the chief over many mayors and many chiefs. In the current term with Mayor Fry and Chief Arredondo, that's included a ban on warrior training, know your rights placards placed in squad cars, deprioritizing low-level marijuana enforcement, and many other incremental reforms that have made some positive changes, many of which I've supported. And we've also seen this term in the last half of the term, we've seen the chief stepping up and disciplining and firing officers when they're involved in misconduct in a way that is a little bit unprecedented and important. At the same time, while the council doesn't have a direct role, of course, complete control is given to the mayor in the charter. We certainly have found strategies to intervene in policy in a variety of ways. And I would say the most successful ways that we've done that have been where we found alignment with the mayor and the chief. So, and used our powers of audit and our ability to make suggestions, both through the budget and by asking questions about how things are being implemented. So successful strategies, I'll credit Councilmember Palmisano for some really persistent work on body camera compliance, for example, is something that the council has weighed in on and I think made an impact on in collaboration with the mayor and the chief. We've also used our budget to support programs that we align with, for example, expanding the co-responder program to all 5 precincts. And we have passed citywide policies that do apply to the police department that are not preempted by other state laws regarding law enforcement. For example, the data privacy work that I've had the opportunity to lead on. The less successful moments have been when we've been asking harder questions where we run up against misalignment with the mayor and the chief and how they want to proceed. So, for example, we've been asking difficult questions prompted by community around traffic stops and racial bias in traffic stops. And after being promised a report many times over, have still not received it and have received some incremental policy changes that don't seem to address the real concerns that we are raising. And so as we've tried to do more policy that runs into more debate, we've had a hard time moving it forward under the current arrangement. So what we have mostly focused on in the lack of direct power over the police department is add-on projects. And so we've been very focused on pilot programs in the Office of Violence Prevention, for example, which we established this term and have invested in to get community safety strategies beyond policing implemented, and investments in community partners like Mad Dads and Next Step and so on for de-escalation work. We've worked in local collaborations. I've been involved in the downtown collaborative work, working with the First Precinct and also with the DID and St. Stephen's and YouthLink and all of the other players that work together and sort of worked on those collaborations around nightlife issues. And there are things like that happening in neighborhoods all over the city. We passed a policy in the 2040 plan, Policy 84, that I think is noteworthy because it articulates a clear desire and a clear set of action steps that we all voted on together and that were part of that extended community engagement process to identify a holistic approach to public safety that included community safety strategies beyond policing. And then we've been laying the groundwork to explore those alternatives, both through pilot projects that have been tested in the field that are ready to be stepped up, and also through studies that we've ordered. We formed a 911 work group that is a mix of city staff and appointees from the community. We have engaged and funded a workforce study to look at the way staffing operates within MPD. The mayor and the council collaboratively have formed an off-duty task force. The audit committee is looking at directed patrol, and the PCOC has announced that they're launching a study on self-initiated police calls. And so we're getting a very comprehensive look at all of the different work that happens in policing and laying the groundwork to make some of the decisions that are ahead of us. Now, the outcomes of that work are extremely mixed. The outcomes are that we've done significant public engagement and that a lot of people have been involved in a lot of different steps, and the council has voted many times over on looking into alternatives to our current model of policing. That pilots have been authorized and shown strong results that we can build on. But at the same time, many of them have not been increased to scale, and traditional policing has still been the way that we're approaching public safety. Crime has increased despite a continued increase to the police budget above and beyond increases to current service level. The discipline imposed by Chief Arredondo has been frequently overturned. Some of the incremental policy introduced by the mayor and the chief has been implemented, and some has produced observable outcomes. The city is facing a steady stream of lawsuits and complaints for violations of safety and civil rights. Our constituents report reduced trust in the department and by extension the city, and a lack of transparency about how decisions are made. The city is under investigation by the Department of Human Rights. The city has had to call in the National Guard to manage civil unrest. Federation leaders have told the press explicitly they are withholding aspects of their labor while the city still pays for a police force. And data shows the traffic stops for the month of June are about half what you would expect. And residents are increasingly finding that the MPD does not provide a response to violations of rules, ranging from—
Please, council member.
Yep, I'll speed it up. Ranging from violent behavior to dangerous drag racing to illegal fireworks, and they are calling on the city with the expectation of response. We are not producing the results that our city wants at this time, and it is time for dramatic structural change. Thank you. I'll turn it over to Councilmember Ellison.
I want to thank the Charter Commission for having us, and I'll try to keep it brief. I know we're going into time, but I think these are important topics. My name is Jeremiah Ellison. I represent Ward 5 here in Minneapolis. So for years, we've spent millions on the police department, including on reforms and settlements, but have not seen a return on that investment. We have been met with the stark realization that our police department in its current form has failed to keep us safe. We are now looking to reimagine a system for public safety that actually works. So here's the decision ahead of our community. Right now, our investment in public safety is about $193 million into the police department, which includes a sworn force of 888 and non-sworn support staff engaging in activities ranging from community outreach, data analysis, investigation support, communications, and much more. Our investment in violence prevention strategies outside of the police investment by comparison is about $1.5 million, which is under 1% of what we give to police. We're inviting the community into a year-long conversation about how to invest in public safety differently to produce better outcomes and build stronger community trust, which could include greater investment in public health-based violence prevention strategies, investment in non-police response capacity to nonviolent emergency calls, investment in expanding existing resources at the county, including non-police mental health response, investing in expanding existing or creating new medical emergency response for opioid overdose or other medical emergencies currently most commonly responded to by police, and the consideration of the roles for which armed police are still the best response, and ways to create accountability and oversight for the use of that authorized force and power of arrest. So whether you want to keep some form of police and add an unarmed response to nonviolent incidents, or you want to abolish the police entirely, or you simply want more community control over the current policing structure, or you think the community should be funded to do their own form of violence prevention, no matter what change you want, however minor or transformative, none are possible under our current charter language. So that's why we've proposed this charter change. It's important that our city government be able to enact the changes residents believe will make them safer. The proposed amendment eliminates the Minneapolis Police Department as a charter department, taking several peculiar aspects of the department in the charter away in the process. Under the existing charter, the mayor has complete control over the police department. This results in lost transparency in policymaking and a reduced ability for residents to advocate for changes. Under the existing charter, the power to discipline rests solely with the chief of police. Discipline has often bottlenecked with everything, including coaching and written reprimands, having to be performed by the chief. This clause also has prompted the state to view sergeants and lieutenants as non-supervisory, as discipline authority is a defining feature of management in state law. And so this has allowed lieutenants and sergeants to stay in the Federation bargaining unit with their supervisees. Under the existing charter, there must be a minimum number of employees in this department. This charter language passed on the ballot in 1961 and has placed constraints on mayors and councils that have followed, limiting leverage to budget negotiations and at the bargaining table. Under the existing charter, the chief is nominated by the mayor and appointed by the council every 3 years, less frequently than other department heads, reducing the frequency of a key lever of the elected government's oversight. Under the existing charter, the Office of Violence Prevention is a division within the health department, and national experts have identified this structure as a barrier to elevating and supporting the work of community safety and violence prevention. And so the proposed amendment solves these problems by creating a new Department of Community Safety with the same reporting structure and appointment schedule as every other city department, allowing for the creation within the department of a division of law enforcement, which would employ peace officers authorized by the post board under state law to use force and make arrests. And in recognition of our intention to frame law enforcement as one of several strategies for community safety, the proposed amendment states as a qualification of the department director that they have public safety experience outside of just law enforcement context. In recognition of the unique power instilled by the post board officers, we provide for the council and mayor to approve the appointed leadership of the Division of Law Enforcement as well. And so lastly, to close this out, I will pass it to my colleague, Councilmember Alondra Cano.
I'm sorry, but we're way over time, so we're going to switch to questions and answers now. We think it would be most productive if we have a back and forth with questions and give you the opportunity to answer. So I'm going to turn it over to Commissioner Rubenstein, who is the chair of our work group on this subject. We compiled a number of questions when we met yesterday, and I'll let her start off. Again, 1 minute for questions, 3 minutes for answers. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and thank you to all the City Council members for being here. I apologize first, some of our questions are rather long and we're only looking for short answers, but we'll do our best to move it along so that other commissioners can have a chance to ask questions. Our first question is, the proposed amendment contemplates that the council may maintain a division of law enforcement services consisting of licensed officers, as you just mentioned. Is there currently consensus on the council as to whether the council will maintain such a division and how big the division will be? How do you intend to develop that consensus if you don't yet have one?
Thank you for the question. I can just start and then invite any of my colleagues to jump in, knowing that we intend to be brief. So, I think one of the questions that I know this body wrestles with a lot, especially in the lead up to the 2013 plain language charter amendments, is what level of detail belongs in a city's charter versus in other documents such as ordinances. So you could point to our emergency management functions, which are outlined in significant detail in ordinance, but do not appear in the charter. Or compare the police department, which currently has a significant amount of detail in the charter, to the other operating charter departments of the city. So this proposal, which would move policing into this bigger department as a division, I think would require ordinance to guide several details related to the functioning of that department, including the command structure, including accountability mechanisms, clarifying how it reports through to existing or if state law changes, future accountability mechanisms. So it's clear that that some of that detail would need to be in ordinance. I think I can speak with relative confidence that the consensus of the council would be that there needs to be some level of peace officers in the new division, and that a transition to this new form of charter department structure would take time. So, and the benefit of having things come through the city council process is that we have a transparent public process for each of our decisions, for ordinances, for budgets, that all have public hearings and thorough vetting at the council. So I don't know if anyone else wants to jump in, maybe Councilmember Fletcher.
Yes, thank you. I will just jump in briefly to reinforce that there's a commitment on the council to doing things in a planful and studied way, and the 911 work group and a lot of the other research that really demonstrates how are we responding and what are the ways that we're providing an appropriate city response to each category of 911 call is at the heart of our work. We're very committed to public safety and to creating a system that provides better public safety in the end. And I think that's important for people to hear. I also think in the difference between may versus shall, one of the examples that's come up frequently is Camden, New Jersey. And the interesting thing about Camden, New Jersey is not that I necessarily think it's a terrific model. I actually don't want to lift it up as the example that I would want us to go to. But in many ways, what they had to do ultimately was that they had a department that they did not feel they could reform, and they shut it down. And they had the county hire a police department. So the city did not operate a police department. And the difference for us between may versus shall is that option on the table? Is there the opportunity in may versus shall for future city leaders, whether it's this term, next term, or 10 terms from now, to decide that there would be a better configuration of the provision of law enforcement that could solve administrative and management problems by outsourcing to another jurisdiction, by merging with another jurisdiction, as many municipalities do around the state, and as many have proposed that we do in Minneapolis. We'd like to leave that option on the table.
Councilmember.
Thank you. I just have a follow-up question then to Councilmember Fletcher. If what I heard you say is that we could, by the language that you proposed for the charter, we could, if we wanted to, shut down the police department and move it to some other, or request another jurisdiction to take over. I guess I don't understand how that will address the structural racism that's inherent in any police department. It's just not just the Minneapolis Police Department. Will that just get us back where we were?
Maybe I can jump in it and say that's absolutely one of the reasons why I think Councilmember Fletcher wasn't necessarily looking at Camden as an alternative. So what we have to do is start imagining the possibilities. In fact, what if there was some agency that had solved that problem that we wanted to contract with? Wouldn't it be nice if we had a charter that would allow us to do so?
Okay. Thank you. Our next question is, the proposed amendment essentially strips away from the mayor his authority over law enforcement in the city, one of his primary charter duties. Are you concerned that this creates or confirms that Minneapolis has a weak mayor system? And why do you think such a system is in the best interests of the city? This is a long question, and I apologize. And how will this shifting of power change the police culture? And finally, would you accept breaking down the amendment into 2 or more ballot questions to separate those issues for the voters?
Councilmember Ellison here, and I'll also allow my colleagues to jump in. I think that the status quo, we came to the Charter Commission a couple of years ago looking to address this, and I think the current system doesn't really allow for enough transparency about how policies get made. I don't think anyone here has an interest in micromanaging the day-to-day, but I think that what we're interested in is knowing that when the people of Minneapolis elect city leadership and when the city council feels that a policy needs to be passed by in order to that the police department should follow, that the police department have to follow it. Right as of right now. And I think that Councilmember Gordon can sort of speak to his whole experience with regulating tasers, the use of tasers. We don't have that authority over the police. And I think that a lot of our constituents are under the impression that we have that authority. The new language, I think, is designed to give us that authority. And again, not to micromanage the day-to-day of what the department head would do, but does allow us to pass an ordinance and to be transparent about what the policies are that the police should and shouldn't be following.
Thank you. Go ahead. Sorry.
I'll just note that the city has a hybrid system. It's not a strong or a weak mayor at this time. We have our unique system. It's more democratic than many other cities. This small change wouldn't take away any of the other significant powers and authority that the mayor has, including to veto any action on part of the city council. It also, the mayor also proposes the budget. The mayor also is there at the executive committee and brings forth all the department heads and would still be doing so with these. So I don't want somebody to start expanding this into doing something that it does not do. It would, I think, preserve, in fact, it would make more consistent the unique form and balance that we have in the city of Minneapolis and take this one department that's an anomaly and make it consistent with the other highly professional departments that are managed very effectively through the council and the mayor and their cooperation.
Thank you. The next question is, many of the changes that you are suggesting and that could be implemented with the existing charter. And Councilmember Fletcher just outlined some of those steps that have already been taken. For example, one thing that we thought of was that community safety and violence prevention personnel could be added either in another department or in a new non-charter department. The number of police department employees, including sworn and non-sworn personnel, could be reduced by 30%. And I think one of you mentioned that. Why can't the city take these steps that would then inform us all over time as to what and whether charter change is necessary?
I'd be happy to tackle that question, Commissioner Rubenstein. This is Councilmember Alondra Cano. I'm the council member for Ward 9, as well as the chair of our Public Safety Committee, and have been working on these issues for 7 years now as a sitting council member. I'll say that first and foremost, we have to acknowledge and recognize and give due respect to the thousands of Minneapolis residents who took to the streets to respond to the cruel and cold murder of Mr. George Floyd, and to give them the right and the space to vote on this charter question in November. As such, that means that communally as a city, we want to redefine how we protect each other and how we support one another when we need help and we need protection. And so I will say that to those specific questions about like, why can't we just continue to tinker with the system the way it is and just beef up this other department and keep MPD the same? The answer is that that's what we've been trying to do for the last, at least under my understanding and my watch, 5 years. Where a lot of that reform work I really truly believed in, and I saw all of that work go down the drain as 4 officers, and specifically one of them, used his own body as a weapon against a resident to take his life unfairly, unjustly, and in the middle of a resident street. So specifically, we must change the charter in order to be able to give life to all of the ideas that our community residents believe can make a difference in how we keep our community safe and how we protect one another. Many of you know that our charter currently locks us into a funding formula that we cannot vote on the council or through the mayor to change. The city's constitution, known as the charter, has a funding formula that states that for every Minneapolis resident, we must fund 0.0017 police officers. And that's precisely one of the specific pieces of our public safety architectural system that we're asking our community to decide upon. And without the ability to address that, we as a city will not be able to duly, wholeheartedly, and in full transparency take up the mandate that so many of our residents have stated they want, which is they want to be able to respond to safety issues outside, over, and above an armed police officer. And many of the people on one side of the spectrum who don't want more armed police officers responding to their community, and many of the community members who would like more officers to take care of homelessness and opioid overdoses and prostitution, they all agree with the fact that our system right now doesn't work. It's not producing the results that we want. So the constitution of our city must change in order for us to really address that funding issue that we are currently being forced to govern under.
Thank you, council member. We're out of time.
Thank you. Your answer is quite compelling, and of course we've heard that same pain and grief from a lot of people, but we've also gotten hundreds of communications on both sides, and many people have been very concerned that this process is rushed, that it lacks sufficient detail or plan for voters to make an informed decision, and most of all, that they're afraid. So we wondered what you're going to do to address those fears, and particularly concerned that are people more likely to vote for such a change after the year-long engagement or development process?
So there would not be a structure for such a vote to be a literal vote, the way a ballot initiative would be at the end of a year-long engagement process. But the way city engagement works, it happens in a lot of different ways and in a lot of different registers. And frankly, having an option for people to weigh in on the ballot partway through that process feels like an extremely positive sort of midway check-in a way. I think it's a particularly good way to get a very broad sample of where people are at as we go through this process. The truth is, I think that there's been a lot of fear and a lot of confusion, and I think that makes sense with what our city's been through. But what we're actually describing is a much more planful and intentional process than I think what's often been portrayed. And I think it's important that we continue to communicate that, continue to invite people into that process in a whole lot of ways. We've instructed staff to come back on July 24th with a report on what that engagement is going to look like so that people start to understand where their voices fit into that process. And we'll continue to stand up pilot programs and to stand up opportunities for people to actually see what we're talking about as we propose different solutions so that people can get a more tangible idea of what we might mean by alternative responses.
And you've probably answered this, but I wanted to ask it anyway. How will this amendment change the culture of law enforcement in Minneapolis? The law enforcement division will still have a union, will still have arbitration, and most of the licensed officers will still live outside the city. How does this amendment actually accomplish culture change within the law enforcement officers community?
If my colleagues are cool, I'm happy to address this. I think that we see that there are basically three major barriers to in the way of some of the transformational change that constituents are asking for here in the city of Minneapolis. One is the state legislature, the other is the police federation, and the last one is the charter. I think the first two are kind of non-starters. They require that we plead with Republican leadership that are not willing to come to the table. The police federation recently went on a media campaign to say that I believe one of them was quoted as saying they view accountability as an attack. And so those two pathways are sort of non-starters, but those would more, I think, pointedly address law enforcement specifically. What the charter allows us to do is reimagine public safety entirely. And we have heard from enough constituents that say that they are interested in reimagining public safety to pursue this pathway. So you ask about how this could change law enforcement in particular. I think mostly what it does is it changes the culture of public safety, more importantly. And to some of my colleagues' points, we will be able to de-emphasize the role of armed use of force response to every issue, which I think will go a long way. And so that's sort of how we would address law enforcement. But mostly, I think that we address public safety as a whole, and we remove the monopoly on public safety away from the police department.
If I may add, I think there's an important structural element here, and I think it's important that we be clear-headed about how difficult culture change is. It's not something you can change with a few policies or even with a charismatic leader. It's something where you have a culture that isn't working, you have to change the structure. And one of the things that doesn't work about our current police department and that creates the culture that we have, is that it operates on an island. It operates very separate from the rest of the city. And a lot of that is actually enshrined in charter. Its independence is very clear in the unique way that it's described in charter and the unique way that it reports to authority and doesn't report to some authority. And that has led to a department that doesn't integrate with the rest of the city particularly well. As we're making citywide policy changes, it has its own communications, its own data management, its own finance, its own sort of infrastructure, and doesn't particularly interact with the rest of the city. And creating a new structure that actually places it within a department that has normal reporting authority and that would be interacting with the rest of the city, I think is one of the elements that would create culture change over time. The relational work that we would need to do across the entire city enterprise to really change how people view public safety and how MPD views their role within it is something that I think the structure can help create.
Thank you. Commissioner Rubenstein, how many more questions do you have?
Just one.
Okay.
Or maybe.
Will other commissioners please use their chat if they have a question to let me know, and I will call on you in the order that you chat. Thank you.
I have a question that I would like to ask.
Just a minute. We're not ready for you, Commissioner Cohen. We're
Okay.
Chair Clegg, if it might be useful for me to yield my time because the other commissioners might ask the same questions I had anyway. So I'd be happy to do that.
Commissioner Jerome Isaacson has a question. Commissioner?
Thank you, Mr. Chair. We've heard from a couple of the council members, and first, thank you, council members, for being here and engaging with the Charter Commission. I really do appreciate that, and I know the public does as well. A couple of commissioners mentioned the alignment of the police department back into removing the police department as a charter commission so they could realign it with the rest of the departments of the city and how they can control those departments. And this was the conversation very similar to what we had in 2018. And back in 2018, the city attorney issued a memo to the Minneapolis Charter Commission on September 2018, which was in response to our questions to the Gordon Charter Amendment. The city attorney said at the time that, quote, other than the charter language provided for the executive committee and its powers to appoint, suspend, and remove officers, the charter gives the city council has no direct control over the officers and employees of any department in the city. Each department head has the authority to write policies and procedures for the respected department, generally sets the standards for the department employees, and controls the operations of the department. The city council approves business plans and ultimately can set the budget, but does not have the authority to direct the internal operations of any city department. That's current practice. In the conclusion of the memo, the city attorney states the powers and authority of the mayor and the city council are distinct, with the mayor having clear executive authority over the internal operations of the police department. The city council has the same authority over the police department as it does over all city departments. Its authority to legislate and set enterprise policies, goals, and strategic direction, hold hearings, and require accountability of any reports and information from the PD. According to this memo, the city council already has the same control over the police department as it does with every other department. One of the main arguments in support of this amendment is that the city council does not currently have control over the police department as it has over other departments. Many of you have told the public that you need the police department moved out of the charter department so it can be treated the same way as other departments. How does this amendment eliminate the police department and creating a public safety violence prevention department give you more control over policies and procedures, ensuring the safety of all residents and the accountability over the service providers?
I can start and see if others want to jump in. I do think the critical piece of that memo is reiterating the charter language itself, which is that the mayor has complete power over the police department. And the memo did give some examples of things that the council could do. I would argue that in practice, using the budget as a leverage tool for policy or culture change in the police department is neither effective nor transparent for the public, and it creates a really I think, difficult relationship that wouldn't exist if there was more direct control over that department. Some examples of way that we direct not the individual employees themselves, but the work of departments are some policy directives that we've given to other departments in the city. For example, the Complete Streets policy that directs the work of the Public Works Department, the Renters First policy that directs the work of the Regulatory Services Department, and sets policy priorities for those departments that the employees are expected to follow per the direction of policymakers. I think another example is the difference between setting use of force policy internally within the department through the mayor and the chief versus having a transparent public discussion about policies that the department has, like its use of force policy. So per the memo, the city council could ban all employees who work for the city from using chokeholds, for example. But that's like a disingenuous way to really talk about our authority over employees, and I think is a confusing way for us to engage with a department that we do not have policy authority over per the charter. So I think it's important to really, I think, be clear about what the charter says and the barriers that it creates for policymakers and for that transparent public process that comes along with the city council's process.
Mr. Chair, if I could just to follow up.
Go ahead, Commissioner.
I thank the President Bender for that, but this was a memo that was pretty clear from our own city attorney. So if there's more clarification needed on what you can and can't do, I think you should get that because I think
I have the memo. I'm reading from it.
Yep, so do I. The second question that I have is, and this is the last one, Mr. Chair. Why are you not taking the time to create the details of the plan now, presenting it to voters for next year? Why not take a year now to hash out the details? Asking the voters to trust you on the details is like the president asking us to defund Obamacare first, and we can worry about the replacement details later. There's not much trust in that process. Why should we have trust in this one?
Yeah, I'm happy to jump in and have my colleagues sort of follow up on that. I think one of the first thing to say is that as my colleagues have already pointed out, the charter does not typically house the level of detail that sort of people in the have said that they want, and often that level of detail is hashed out in ordinance. The other thing that I'll say is that a lot of the things that we plan to do with the Office of Violence Prevention is we're already doing, but they're hard to take up to scale, and they are not coordinated with our main source of public safety, which is the police department. This allows us to sort of consolidate all things public safety, have them be coordinated, de-emphasize the sole role of police as synonymous with public safety, and it gives us the opportunity to engage with the public and actually be able to apply public feedback. I think that I think your comparison is pretty disingenuous, but the main reason is because if we engage in a year-long process with community, and we finally come to some consensus on what this new form of public safety should look like, some of which we already have and can take to scale now, we then have to tell the public who has been under the impression that they're redesigning public safety, that they are going to have to wait another year or another cycle or take more time before we can actually implement this plan. I think that's disingenuous to lead people on thinking that they're designing something that they're not actually able to implement. And so I think this allows us the space to either keep the status quo by and large, or make the changes, the transformative change, and redesign public safety in the way that the public has asked to.
Thank you. Next, I know that Commissioner Cohen is on the phone, so can't chat, but I think he had a question.
Okay, here's my question.
1 minute, Commissioner.
That's all it's going to take. None of us are police officers. None of you are police officers. These proposals all affect the lives, careers, well-being, families of at least 800 police officers. Don't you think we should at least hear from the rank and file police that we are discussing here and their representatives before we take any action? I address the question to whichever member of the City Council cares to answer.
I'd be happy to take that question. This is Councilmember Alondra Cano, and I've had the privilege to work with police officers on the ground responding to specific shootings and other activity in our neighborhoods. I will say that they are welcome to be a part of the conversation, as many of them as want to be, as long as we continue to center the voice and impact of police violence on communities of color, indigenous communities, and communities that have been coming to us for many, many years asking for change. So I don't think that this should be framed as an anti-police initiative. I think that if you look at the language, we say that we want to enact the changes by May 21st. We know that the approach has to be thoughtful, inclusive, and intentional. No one is claiming that the department will disappear tomorrow or in a month. In fact, this is why we are asking the voters of Minneapolis to go to the ballot box in November, and I'm hoping that you all will support that as well. I did answer your question. I did answer your question. I said to you that the police officers are invited to be a part of this discussion. Please do not speak over me when I'm trying to respond to your question. If you didn't hear it, I'm happy to respond again. Police officers are welcome to be a part of this process as long as they center the voices of people of color and the victims of police brutality. I will also like to remind you that this is a conversation that should be led by Minneapolis voters, the people who live in this community, the people who have to take care of the traumatic events here at home, while 85% of our police force goes home to the suburbs or another city. So I want to make sure that we are honoring, respecting, and authentically centering the voices of Minneapolis voters.
And I didn't answer my question.
Hold on, I'm gonna have
before we take any action from the representatives of the Minneapolis Police.
Commissioner Cohen,
the rank and file of the police department. We're talking about it. Why shouldn't we hear from them?
Please listen, Commissioner Cohen. I'm going to give you another 20 seconds for a follow-up, and then that's it. Okay?
Here goes. I think before we take any further action on this matter, we should hear from the representatives of the rank and file of the Minneapolis Police Department as to their views on these suggested changes.
Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Cohen, for the question and the follow-up. I think that the views of Bob Kroll, who you're maybe not naming, but that's who you're talking about, are well documented in the public discourse. And if I may, I think that I don't think that we should wait to take action. But I do agree with Councilmember Cano that the police are invited into this discussion and absolutely should be. I think I'm less interested in hearing from Bob Kroll, and I do think that there are inspectors and/or rank and file officers that could lend individual perspectives, especially the ones that actually live in Minneapolis. I think I would welcome their feedback to the proposal. But I also want to remind this body that nearly 94% of our department does not live within the city, meaning that 94% of our police department is not subjected to their own style of policing. And so I think that the people who live in Minneapolis, and that includes the 6-7% of officers that actually live here, should have the say, and that we shouldn't wait for a body that has, I think, universally rejected living in our city to take action about the public safety of our residents.
Thank you. The next question is Commissioner Ginder. Commissioner.
I have a kind of a question that goes back that several council members have raised, is that they are prohibited by the charter from taking significant action with the police department. Part of that confusion is with the power of the budget that the city council has. If, for example, the charter requires 17 police officers per 1,000, that's roughly 710 police officers. We currently have, I think somebody said earlier, 888 police officers. Why hasn't the city council in any of its previous budget settings just simply defunded up to 180 police officers? You could have done it last year or the year before or this coming year. It's roughly $20 million that would be available for the Office of Violence Prevention or any other projects that you wanted to entail.
Peter, this is Councilmember Cano. Good to see you again. Thanks for your service to the city of Minneapolis for so many years. I will say that I think that keeping that relationship intact in the charter really continues to codify and solidify the type of culture, abusive culture we saw out on the streets of Chicago and 38th. And I think you've known me for a few years now, and we had the opportunity to work together on the council. I was a reformist. I thought that we could fix that old broken system if we just dumped enough money into it. And honestly, when I woke up and I saw that video on Tuesday morning, I completely changed. My framework, my thinking, my analysis of all of that work, where you and I and Susan Siegel and many others spent countless hours trying to fix and redeem this system that has been handed down to us from generation to generation. It just felt to me like it just was not going to be possible. And I couldn't under any guise or circumstance face my voters and say, you know what, we're going to issue another training and that'll fix it. You know what, we're going to issue another memo and that's going to get at it. You know what, we're going to give them more gadgets and that's going to get to it. That's not what's going to get to it. Going after the architectural composition of our policing system is at the heart of this deep transformation we must begin. And that is key here. It's the beginning of a process. It's not okay to have everything figured out right now. In fact, that's why we're in the problem we're in today. This is why it's so important to allow our voters to take that vote in November, to renew that social contract that we have lost. Half of our city burned down because there is no trust in these systems. So I think it's really important, Peter, to recognize, and Commissioner Ginder, I apologize, I just remember working with you so much, that the ability to create a new charter department that has an overarching framework that leads with public health, that leads with solutions above and beyond an armed officer, are extremely important to get at that policing culture that otherwise we would leave intact by just poking at the budget. And the budget changes, if we leave them the way that they are in the charter, will only take us so far. It will never really let us materialize and fully spread out, this I would say grassroots energy that we have, where there are thousands of ideas in our inbox about how to do better community safety. We are not going to be in a place where we don't have ideas about how to do it better. We're going to be in a place where our community is going to be able to come together in a moment of abundance to say, wow, look at all these amazing people and energy and solutions, and let's prioritize them. So I would say that it would be wrong to continue to codify the policing system as it is now without truly restructuring, rethinking, and reframing the approach of policing to make sure that we're not leading with armed officers, and that we are making sure that we're leading with public health. We're looking at the root causes, we're looking at violence interruption, and that we're doubling down on that body of work that the city has already started, has already germinated, has already cultivated over many years, to really give them and give that body of work a fighting chance, because so far the funding efforts can only take us to a certain level. And if we reduce our police force to whatever, 730 officers, but continue to remain, it stays in that same container, as my colleagues often use that terminology, that container will still be moldy, and it'll still be stale, and it'll still be broken, and we'll be stuck carrying wrongful deaths. We'll be stuck carrying those wrongful deaths, and I cannot allow that under my watch anymore. And I hope that you charter commissioners are also ready to not allow that under your watch anymore.
Thank you, Council Member. The next question is from Commissioner Sandberg.
Okay, let me unmute. So many issues, it's hard to address them all. I'm not sure I have my original question. Okay, first of all, if in fact the real issue is council authority, and this kind of makes me think a bit about Commissioner Abbott's suggestion about the legislative versus executive. This came up in 2018. We had some concerns with it. It went back to the council. It died, as far as I can tell. It never came forward. They easily could have modified this because I think that's part of it, and put it on the ballot for this year, but I don't know where it went. Perhaps Councilmember Gordon would like to answer that issue, if that's the primary issue. Frankly, it kind of looks like to some of us, and some people have contacted me, that this is a great way to get rid of the union. You're going to get rid of one department, the police department. You're going to create a new department. Everybody has to reapply if they want to be in the new department. The union's gone. We'll have to have a new union, I suspect. And maybe that's part of the motivation. I am not sure. I haven't heard that discussed too much, but I guess my idea is, why didn't you continue with the work to deal with your authority that was started in 2018? Because I think you had a good start, but it just disappeared.
Thank you, Commissioner Sandberg. I'm happy to jump in on the early part of that. I believe that the issue is not simply council authority, although I do think that that's a major roadblock to transformative change. But I also believe that the design of policing in and of itself and the monopoly that policing has on public safety is a major part of the problem. And so what you're seeing in front of you is I think, something that actually gets at a lot of the root causes. Now, no charter amendment in the history of charter amendments is going to solve systemic racism. But I think that what we can do here is we can address the monopoly on public safety that the police currently have, and we can say that there are other ways to keep the public safe. And as a matter of fact, maybe simply responding after the fact is not the best way to do it. Maybe violence prevention, which we have a framework for, and we do in the city, is a better place to start, and we can move from prevention to response, whereas currently we only do response. I think to Commissioner Ginder's point, a lot of the council members that you're talking to are council members who were in favor of funding the Office of Violence Prevention at much higher levels than we did. And some of those efforts failed. Some of those efforts succeeded. I think what you're seeing now is a better way to address public safety as a whole, and not simply address one of the major problems, but maybe all of them. And I could turn it over to my colleague, Councilmember Fletcher, to give a minute-long response as well.
Thank you. I'll just note that, that when that came back to us too late to get on the 2018 ballot, there then wasn't a 2019 ballot for us to put us on. We didn't have an election in 2019, so it wouldn't have made sense to ask people to come to the polls just for that. And I think 2 years of learning, and frankly 2 years of observation of some really successful pilots and some really encouraging work related to violence prevention, and I think the current events on the ground have informed some bigger, deeper structural issues than just the question of the transparency that can be created by moving policy into the council's domain.
Thank you. And Commissioner Sandberg, I know you had asked Councilmember Gordon, but in the chat, he said he had to step out for a while. So
right, and maybe he'll catch up on it, because I would be interested to hear what he had to say about it. Certainly, the issue of council authority could have been worked into what people want to do now. And the fact, yes, there was no election in 2019, but sometimes gathering community input and so forth on these issues takes time. So
thank you.
Interesting. We'll hear more. Thank you.
Next on to Commissioner Abbott. No. It doesn't. I don't think you had a question, Commissioner Abbott. Do you?
I do have a question. Yes.
Okay, go ahead.
There's a lot of concern expressed in the community comment we've gotten so far. People don't know what the future looks like. So I want to give you guys an opportunity to paint a very granular, specific picture for the residents who might be listening to this meeting. What happens? I mean, I realize there's going to be a debate about how this all looks, right? I mean, I realize sitting here today, you don't have a final answer, but what can you like, if you're a citizen of the city of Minneapolis and you call 911, what happens? How does that call get diverted to community safety or the new law enforcement department? What kind of preventative measures are you talking about? I mean, do people come out before 911 gets called? I just, from a very concrete visual standpoint, I think it would be helpful for people to kind of understand what your concept is. And I think maybe Councilmember Fletcher would be a good one to answer this. I read your article about a month ago in Time, and I thought it was very helpful.
Thank you. I'm happy to kick this off and then kick it to my colleagues, and I appreciate the question. I think the future is something that provides a significantly greater sense of safety than what we currently have, and I think it does it in a few different ways. I think, as you mentioned, Commissioner Abbott, I think it includes prevention. I think that there are situations right now that if we can be doing proactive outreach that addresses the sense of desperation, the sense of unhealth, the sense of trauma that people are living with and carrying into decisions that they make in the future, we can limit the extent to which people are exposed to situations of unsafety in the first place. And so that is one area where we can really improve as a city, is in our proactive prevention and care for each other. I also think that we can make a much smarter response through 911 dispatch and through a much more intentional integration of the entire city enterprise in the work of public safety, so that we're sending the best experts in each area to respond to each situation. So as an example, right now we have police officers responding to traffic accidents. Traffic accidents, what really needs to happen is three things. We need to do health triage for people who might have been injured. We need to do logistics management while the accident gets cleaned up, and we need to take reports. And those reports would be a lot better if they were being taken by somebody who knows something about traffic engineering, and so they were taking accurate details so that we could actually get data about what went wrong that caused the traffic accident, which right now we get terrible data back. So that's an area where I would say, as we look at it, I think the community has a chance to say, man, let's redesign that. Let's do that better. And so our goal is that we send a response that's appropriate to the call, that we send a response that is polite, that's empowered to solve problems for people, that makes people feel like they're better off for having called. And all of those things are things that we don't currently hear in many cases about people's current experience with an awful lot of 911. Now, at the same time, and it is worth saying, when we take apart all of the different kinds of 911 calls that we get, there are types of calls that I believe the community is going to say, we need an armed response to that. I believe the community is going to say, we have an obligation as a city to be able to respond to an imminent threat of violence, and we need to maintain the capacity to do that. I think that that's going to change what public safety looks like. I think communities can be much more empowered to participate in the small level interactions that can potentially prevent things from escalating into 911 calls. I think 911 can be much more responsive with a much greater array of skills and services. And I think we can be doing a lot more prevention on the front end to keep situations from arising into emergencies.
Thank you, Council Member. Next is Commissioner Garcia, and then Commissioner Newborn.
Thank you, Chair Clegg. First, I'd like to correct Commissioner Ginder in that there is 17 police officers for 10,000 residents, not 1,000 residents, as I've been doing the math. Secondly, thank you, Commissioner Sandberg, for your question about the efforts we were trying to advance in 2018. One thing I think important to consider is that if we want to have decreased armed responses, what I'm hearing from people, from the public, is what about armed residents who you don't know if they pose an imminent threat until the first responders show up because of our gun laws. And my initial question really would like to circle back to Councilmember Ellison about, from Commissioner Jarreau Isaacson's question with regard to why not develop a comprehensive plan before putting this on the ballot. And while I completely understand that the language in the charter and the charter itself is very brief, nevertheless, a plan that can go into ordinance or a plan that can be presented very comprehensively. For example, you had mentioned, Councilmember Ellison, what the Office of Violence Prevention has come up with, but doesn't have the resources to take to scale. I think sharing that with the public would be advantageous, because what we're hearing is that the council is reactive towards everything, toward a lot of things, and residents really want to see something intentional and well thought out that is very planful. Thank you.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. I think I also want to like sort of level set about the two different the two different planes on which this conversation is being had. I think on one hand, there's the conversation that I think a lot of community members that I'm certainly hearing from, and a lot of community members that the council's hearing from. There's that conversation sort of happening in detail, and I think is a really more honest conversation. There's also, I think, the media narrative that, you know, obviously the council is not equipped to dominate, right, in the same way that the local paper is equipped to dominate. But when you see a headline that says the council advances plan to abolish the police, that's not necessarily true, and no council member has necessarily said that, but that's what people read in the Star Tribune. I think that the discussion that you're talking about is a discussion that can be had over the course of an election cycle. And quite frankly, while a media narrative can dominate and persist in the short term, we've seen plenty of situations in which, when it comes election time, the Star Tribune's sort of influence is sort of non-existent, right? The candidates they endorse, the concepts they endorse often fail at the ballot, often don't go their way at the ballot, on the ballot. I think this is a place where, as we pursue this reimagining of public safety, it'll invite the kind of detailed conversation that you're talking about. And while we'll never dominate the media narrative, we will be able to have conversations in backyards and with individual constituents that help folks understand exactly what the Office of Violence Prevention does and what they could do if they were brought to scale. That helps folks understand exactly what the mental health response at the county does and what they could do if they were brought to scale. Those things already exist, right? Now, there are a number of things that I think we are looking to design in terms of other types of emergency response that don't currently exist. But it's not like we are starting from ground zero without any idea of how this thing would function. I think that you know, council members can be as detailed as they would like in their newsletters and on Twitter and on social media. It's not going to have the same sort of immediate reach as the local paper, but over time, I do believe that the truth of the conversation, the more honest version of this conversation, would bubble to the surface.
Chair Clegg, if I may.
Yes, go ahead.
Thank you, Councilmember Ellison. Just for clarity, I do not put much stock into the media when it comes to public policy and what it advances. I think that putting together, what I'm hearing from residents is that they would like the security and the knowledge of a more comprehensive plan that is in place before something general goes on the ballot, or a concept even as general goes on the ballot. And what I'm hearing is that residents would like to see that discussion and that planning happen over the next year, and then have the possibility of changing the charter if needed on the ballot. And I think one thing that kind of precipitates this concept that the city council is reactive is that major initiatives seem to be tied to election years, such as what Commissioner Sandberg said about 2018. I know my own experience in public policy tells me that that could very well be just a coincidence, and that's a theme that that public consumption can just spin off into its own narrative. But I just wanted to clarify that. notwithstanding the media, any media outlets.
Yeah, thank you, Commissioner.
Excuse me, Commissioner, what was your question there, or was that just a clarification?
It was just a clarification.
Commissioner Clegg, I would like just 90 seconds to respond.
Go ahead, council member, go ahead.
Thank you, Commissioner Garcia. I definitely hear that. I do want to remind the public that the city council elections were the year before. So 2018, when we talk about getting something on the ballot during an election year, I think that the sole purpose is for transparency and inclusion of many voices. If we were to try to put a single amendment, charter amendment, on the ballot in a non-election year, I think that what you would have is a small number of people lending their voice to that initiative, and that we would miss an opportunity to get the full opinion of the entire city, especially if you compare, you know, a non-council, non-mayor year to a presidential election year. You're going to get so many more voices at the table, so many more opinions in the ballot box. I think that's why it's important that we sort of time these things in a way that really matter, and that's why I think elections matter. The last thing I would say is that while I know that like a lot of folks on this body might know better than to get all their information from a single media source, right? We also know that the news is the way that a lot of people get information. It doesn't have to be the sole way, but it can be the fastest way, the most Googleable way. And so to have those deeper conversations, I think can happen, especially between now and November. But they would happen a little slower than a headline coming out of the Star Tribune, I guess is what I'm saying. The last point that I'll make is that the type of resident that knows to reach out to the Charter Commission for an issue like this, it might be less than the type of resident who knows to reach out to their council member on the same issue. And so I think that while I 100% appreciate and respect that you all are reading the communications that you're getting, I also want to put in perspective that council members might be getting are likely getting a lot larger sample size of the population reaching out to us. And I think that you know, the competing narratives that you need to have every I dotted and T crossed versus we need systemic change and we need the council to prevent another police killing from happening. You know, so the urgency narrative versus the we need you to have it all figured out narrative is more representative of, I think, of what council members are hearing, which is why we think taking this to voters is the right approach, and not just passing a unanimous, you know, council vote and also doing nothing also feels inappropriate, I think, at this time. So.
And Chair Garcia, I'll just add that I feel like there's I feel like we need to be able to call out the privilege and waiting. There are many communities who have been working on this issue for many, many years, and they've felt ignored, unheard, unwelcomed. And you know, we must remember that the crises that happened when Mr. George Floyd was murdered is something that we've never seen before in these sort of lines of cases. Across the nation, people resoundingly agreed that what happened was horrific and should never be allowed to happen again. So I want to remind everybody that saying that we should just wait until next year to figure it out and we should just take the time. There's something deeply painful about that. When I hear that, you know, like my body has a reaction to that because we just were a part of the most traumatic experience where Minneapolis was the front and center of this conversation in the entire country. And for us to not allow our voters to get into the ballot box and decide with us the future of this conversation, to me, would be a deeply missed opportunity to both honor and respect the voices of the people of Minneapolis and to bring integrity into the conversation of public safety. And as the public safety chair who believed in reform, I can tell you today that that is not the way we should be addressing the situation. We are at a critical moment in time where we really have to step up and challenge that privilege that says we have the time to put our plans together next year. This is the time. People have the energy now. Let our voters vote on this in November. That's the right thing to do.
Chair Clegg?
Yes.
This is Commissioner Lickness. I have a question. I don't know how you want to put me in order here.
Okay, I'll put you on the list, but Commissioner Newborn is next.
Okay.
Hi there. Thanks, Commissioner Chair Clegg, for acknowledging me. So let's say, my question is about, let's say we move forward and this question proposal ends on the ballot and it fails. What is your, from the council members' perspectives, what are your thoughts and sort of plans as it relates to kind of a plan B? Because the issues that you all have outlined in our community as a result of the death of and murder of George Floyd it won't go away because because it failed on the ballot. What would be the sort of plan B, and how do we communicate that plan to our community?
So I could weigh in on that a little bit, if it's all right. I don't think that the council has a plan B. We have 12 votes in unanimous consent to go along with plan A. But I'm sure that all of 12 of us have different plans and options. I will note that we've already opened up some of the ordinances. So they have been referred to committee. So we have an ordinance on the police department, chapter, I think it's, I forget the title, but 171 and also 172 on police oversight. So those will be looked at and those will be studied, and we will see what we can do there. We'll continue to use any leverage we might have with the police contract, which we're stymied along the way because of state law and in a number of ways, but also because we're locked into this contract of having our police department, and they already have their union, and it's right there. So we're dealing with it. We're also going to be looking at other legislative changes that we could advocate for off into the future, including right now. I will say, even and hopefully as you forward it back to us and we put it on the ballot, we'll be steadily making those changes all the way up to November 3rd, and we'll be deeply into our engagement process, talking to the community too. I will note that we might have plan Bs, but I think what's really, really important here is that we stop and we also listen and we walk with others who have their plans and their ideas and their initiatives too. And I think we're going to be particularly sensitive in trying to listen to our BIPOC community and others who've been disenfranchised and who have been not necessarily leading on their plan Bs or Cs or Ds or Es, so that we can be moving forward with those as well. I think if it fails, if it gets on the ballot and if it fails, we'll be looking at what comes next. And chances are there'll be a petition, and it'll be a citizen-led petition that will come forward well before this 150-day problem that we seem to keep bumping into because the due diligence that you I don't know, want to do like you did last time when we did that. But I think then there'll be another ballot initiative. I'll tell you this, when I first ran in 2005, the police charter problem was something I ran on, and I was elected, and I ran on it again 4 years later, and I ran on it again 4 years later, and my voters have studied it, they've talked about it, they've looked at it, they don't understand the structure, and they see that it's a bad structure that we're operating under with our police department again and again. Every time I run, and every time somebody is killed by the police, and every time it comes forward. So I don't think it's going to go away. But I think we have a real opportunity here, like my colleagues, to actually get something on the ballot, and then we can find out. And I suspect, despite a lot of opposition from people who want to go with the status quo and couldn't understand something different and more modern, more professional, despite that, I think there'll be overwhelming support for it this time, because I think we've really hit the mark this time, unlike in 2018 when it was too incremental and too much inside baseball, I think, for folks.
Thank you, Councilmember. Next is Commissioner Mecchi.
Jump in very quickly
before
other
plan Bs.
I have to head out, but I did want to just jump in and just say a couple quick things, in part response to Commissioner Newborn's question, but just generally too, that I think Councilmember Gordon was speaking specific to the charter question, but I think in a lot of other ways, the work that my colleagues have been describing will absolutely continue. And so that this charter question is one important piece of removing some specific barriers to the change that we have been pursuing and will continue to pursue with very broad support in our community. And I think the council members, Councilmember Ellison and Kano, who've spoken about the ways in which we engage with our communities as elected representatives of our wards is really important. I've heard a few questions that sound like we haven't taken time or we haven't heard from people, but we sit through many, many hours of public hearings, you know, on a bi-weekly basis, hearing from our community. We attend neighborhood meetings. We actually have colleagues or constituents call us when they are in distress. That happens to council members all the time. And so we're very deeply connected to the communities that we represent. And I just want to say that as the president of the city council, I implore you to respect my colleagues and their election certificates and the work that they do to represent their constituents and their communities on the city council. And it is noteworthy and important that these actions the council have taken are unanimous, because it shows that the outcry we are hearing in Minneapolis is coming from every ward in the city and every corner of our community for change. So I, like Councilmember Gordon, do not expect that to change. I do not expect people to forget the death of George Floyd or the death of Jamar Clark. We will continue to pursue change with every mechanism available to us, even if the charter continues to limit our authority and our ability to do so.
Thank you, Council Member. We have three commissioners in queue right now. What I'd like to do is finish up with those and then call it an evening. Commissioner Metke is first.
Hello, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. My question actually was for Council Member Bender, but if she is leaving, maybe Council Member Gordon can answer it. But I want to start with a couple other things. You know, I'm a firm believer in the Office of Violence Prevention. Under Mayor Belton, I ran a Southside initiative that focused on elements of intervention, prevention, reentry, diversion, jobs and training, and it led over the 8 years to a 73% reduction of crime. So the more we can do to build up that department and have regular outcomes reported, I do think it will have a huge impact on crime over time. So I just wanted to say that. And the other thing I wanted to say is that Councilmember Ellison brought up a really good question about police residency. And I would like to think that, you know, I would like to see some stats on the enterprise, the entire enterprise, and what residency is in the entire enterprise, because, you know, we've had two planning and CPED people that lived in St. Paul, and I know a lot of regulatory service people live out of Minneapolis, so I think it would be good to look at the entire enterprise as far as that goes. Are you hearing me?
I heard that, and I was referencing a possible question. Okay. It sounded
okay,
like you were.
Hold on. I'm getting to my question.
I'm sorry.
Feedback, so I didn't know if it was going through. So my question goes back to an earlier conversation about the enterprise and business plans and how you don't have any input on business plans. And so what I was going to ask Councilmember Bender is to describe the process of working with the chief to create an annual business plan. And does that happen with the mayor? Does it happen with the mayor and Councilmember Kano? How does that function when those business plans are created? Because I'm aware that the police do create business plans and talk to community about those things a lot. And so I'm structurally, how does that happen, Councilmember Gordon?
Well, and business plan is nomenclature that hasn't been that popular with most recent mayor. So that's sort of a term that Stephen Bosacker, I think, brought forward, or even before that with R.T. Ryback and the previous coordinator. But those are developed usually by the departments. I will say it's very unique to the police department because they even when they come in with their plan, there's no opportunity for the council to give them direction that they actually are compelled to comply with to change their business plan, unlike others. And sometimes years we've been good about having 5-year plans to move forward on. But those plans are much more actively looked at by the council, where they can actually have an impact and a structure around them. Typically, I assume that chiefs talk to the mayor and the mayor's office about those plans, but they tend not to reach out to the council and talk to them because the charter basically cuts the council out of that process. So we can use our bully pulpit when we hear about it, and we can try to get them to come and speak with us and those things, but it's just a little bit different.
So no coordination, communication, cooperation, none of that happens as far as the police department goes, Councilmember Gordon?
It depends on the style of the deputy chiefs and the chief and elsewhere, but I've actually noticed the last 2 administrations, it's been a pretty arm's length kind of process.
If I can jump in, I do want to offer a little bit of a different answer to that, which is that we have, through the budget process, which is the lever that we're able to use under the current charter, created a set of metrics for each department, including the police department, that get reported in the sort of initial run-up to the budget process. So we do have our Results Minneapolis process, which is not the same thing as a business plan, and is certainly not the level of detail that we receive from, for example, Public Works or CPED. But we do have a results process that several of us spearheaded, Councilmember Palmisano and I on the Budget Committee, and others, that I think does at least provide some baseline sense of how things are changing from year to year on the things that we've chosen to measure.
Thank you, Council Member. So the only 2 that I have in queue right now are Lickness and Rubenstein. If anybody else is wanting to ask a question, let me know. But Commissioner Lickness.
Hi, thank you, Chair Clegg and commissioners and council members. The one point, I guess, a question I want to make, there's just a couple and I'll hurry. Currently, the 6th Ward has no representation on the council, and it's one of the highest crime areas in the city. And right now, there's no process for them to give any input or feedback other than just writing an email to you or that. And I'm just saying, okay, I come from the land of NRP. We had to have public hearings to move $10,000. We're talking about defunding the police department. And I think that deserves more than one public hearing. I think it deserves, when they redesigned the community engagement process, they had a huge meeting at the Armory, and they had the easels and the dotmocracy. They did all of that to redesign community engagement. I think redesigning public safety and the police department deserves at least that effort. At least that effort before the voters need a chance to form this. And 6th Ward has no representation, so whatever they think doesn't really matter, and it should matter. And I'm just saying, I believe this process is going too fast. We need more than one public meeting. We need several, and we need to segment what the meeting is going to be about, so people can come and give the general public. I know you said you've done outreach, but you've done outreach to
Commissioner Lickness. What is your question, please? What is your question?
My question is, why are we in such a rush to do this before this new department gets formed properly?
I'd be happy to respond. I think the first thing to remember is that one of the things you said, Commissioner Lickness, that's not true is that we are not here today talking about defunding the police. We are here today talking about a charter amendment change that is a small component of changing the terms of engagement for a year-long engagement process that we've committed to. That's going to have, I am certain, plenty of democracy, plenty of other forms of engagement that range from in-person engagement, online engagement, all kinds of different ways of getting around the challenges of everything from pandemic to language barriers and everything else that we have to make sure that we overcome to make sure that absolutely everybody's voice is in this, and that the people who have been historically marginalized by this system are centered in that process, which includes many of the constituents, as you note, of Ward 6. So I think it's very important that this engagement process not get confused with the conversation about the charter amendment. I will also note that I do think that actual direct democracy at the polls is at least as good as, and I would argue better than, democracy in a rec center somewhere. I think that it's very important that we don't underestimate the value of actually asking the voters what they think. And if we haven't done the outreach work, and if people feel like they don't understand what they're voting for, and there's not a plan by the time we get to November, then many of them will vote no. And that would be a logical outcome if it turns out that we've rushed this. But we are not rushing the process of redesigning and reimagining the police department. We're going to reimagine the police department over a year-long process with extensive community engagement. We're going to announce the next steps in that on July 24th when staff come back to us with an initial proposal for how to begin moving things forward. It's going to be long. It's going to ask you to participate probably more than you even want to. It's going to be one of the most extensive community engagement efforts that we've ever done, and I think it should be, and I think it needs to be, because this is a very important transformation we're talking about. So I'm agreeing with the spirit of your question, but I do want to separate the question of the charter amendment from the question of the transformation of the police department, because we are reimagining public safety, and that is actually not what we're asking the Charter Commission to consider today.
Thank you, Council Member. Last question is Commissioner Rubenstein, who started us off and can finish up for us.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The reason I wanted to ask another question was because one of my questions earlier wasn't answered, but I've listened very hard to everything you've said, and I know the rest of us are doing the same. And we've also been listening very hard to all the comments that we received, and that includes not only the comments we receive as charter commissioners, but for all our other positions in the community and our connections with community groups. And I do want to tell you that we are going to work very hard to find some way to make this succeed. Whoops, my camera's off. What I'm hearing right now is that, and I'm mostly concerned about the vulnerable communities that Councilmember Cano has talked about, that they are very, very divided. And so I fear that if they remain divided, this ballot, this amendment as it's structured now, may fail. And we want a change in the culture and in the way we do things in this city as much as you do, but we want to make sure we're doing what's right. And so my question is, which is much more specific, is are you willing, might you be willing to accept a substitute amendment? I don't know if we're going to have one, but I would just like to know what you're thinking about that. In particular, could we divide the big key components of your amendment so that the voters could have a chance to vote, number one, on a new department, and number two, on a change in the power structure, the governance structure of the police department or the larger department?
Thank you for the question, Commissioner. I guess I'll keep my answer short. The short answer is I guess it would depend on the amendment or the substitution, rather. I apologize. But I can tell you that, so it'll depend on the substitution. But I don't know that we'd be open to any substitution that is just simply no longer the thing that we're here to work on. If we are simply going to have a department, two different departments that handle public safety, one of which with a 152-year history, and that still locks us into a minimum requirement of officers, that still has the same reporting structure, that still cannot be changed without pleading with Paul Gazelka and Bob Kroll and other folks who are not elected by the city of Minneapolis, then I do think that fundamentally changes our ability to even make a good effort at structural change. And I don't know that I would support.
No, I'm sorry, that's not really what I was asking. I don't think I was very clear. I meant, could we have 2 ballot questions instead of 1 ballot question? Is that a possibility?
I think I'd be reluctant to respond, Commissioner Rubenstein, without seeing how you structured that question. I certainly think that each of the problems that we set out to solve are problems that we've identified that we think are significant and are problems that we think need a solution, and that in many ways are intertwined. And I'm not sure how separable they would be. I think if you merely solve the problem of the supervision language without solving the problem of the reporting structure, does it actually fix what we're trying to get at? I'm less sure about that, and so I'd be interested in seeing what you came up with. I think it's worth doing some generative thinking. I would just ask all of you to be very clear-headed about the depth of the problem of a toxic culture in a department that is producing extremely negative results for our city that we are trying to solve. And I think it's very important that we proceed with the kind of intentionality that actually takes those things head on and doesn't present to people a sort of false choice that makes it sound like maybe we could fix it by just doing a half measure. Make sure that you really have thought through the consequences of that, and certainly anything that the Charter Commission brings forward, I think we'll give careful consideration, just as you're giving us careful consideration in this process, and I appreciate your work.
Could I just note on that issue, in terms of what we've presented, we worked long and hard on the pieces and the elements of that. So the items that we chose to repeal were really important to the whole design, and the items that we decided to put back were really important. And we were able to get 12 of us to reach consensus over that after hours and hours of discussion and actually consultation, also internally with other staff and with representatives from the community. So it's I'm a little bit reluctant to think what piece you would, undo, or how you would divide the question and what that would do to it. And if you're asking me to guess on would that hold the 12 feeling comfortable with what we ended up with, and there's not many words there that we put in, and each one of them was painstakingly put in and changed and fixed. And so it took a lot of thought. So dividing the issue might change it pretty dramatically from what at least the council felt comfortable with. But of course, we would love to hear your ideas and all the options you come up with.
Thank you.
Thank you, Councilman Wright. I know a few more names have joined the queue, but I'm going to call it for now. And those who have additional questions can feel free to get in touch with council members directly, or we can
Chair.
This at work group meetings. Yes.
Mr. Chair, I'm sorry. This is Joe Isaacson. The council members have answered questions, but they've also added some commentary. And I would just ask for an opportunity to clarify some things, as I asked early. And I think other commissioners that may want to clarify some things should have an opportunity. We rarely get to meet with the council members. So I would just ask you for a few minutes so that I could do that.
2 minutes, please.
Thank you. So I've been working on police oversight in the city of Minneapolis since 2012. So my conscience is pretty clear, and I think I'm pretty level-headed in knowing the pain that's out there and knowing what the situation is with really bad cops that we have in Minneapolis, and what has happened to George Floyd, and the murder of George Floyd has also put a pit in my stomach, and I know the pain. So I just wanted to say that I know it was mentioned that we have to check our privilege, and I struggle with that because not with checking privilege, but I struggle with saying that we need to check our privilege because we have to have the selection now. If we wait till next year, that's somehow privilege. Well, if in the year we spend meeting with the community, doing the things that you've all talked about, barbecues, and other events, that is helping the community process through this and helping us get to the details. That's going to be helpful. What happens if in November this fails? What are you going to tell the community about the failure? And then what? You have to start from new? I mean, you got to think about that as well. And I just wanted to clarify that, Mr. Chair. Thank you.
All right, any follow-up from council members?
Mr. Clegg, I believe that that was a specific comment I made about making sure that we're checking our privilege when we say let's delay, let's wait, the response and the answers and the actions can happen next year or the year after or the year after that. I think it's actually not a question of why not now, but it's more of like why should we wait a year when we know that people are hungry for the change and when we know that so many people are dissatisfied with our system.
They're hungry for real change, council member.
And we want them to take that vote with us in November as a community. It is the deepest move in democracy to allow our residents to consent to a new system. That's what this process is about, consent. We want our community to make this choice affirmatively with us, for us, and together. It would not make sense for us to delay a year to ensure that we're having all of the privileged conversations that people feel they should have in a moment where communities are feeling that the change is now, the time is now. And you know what? I'm not afraid of the question not passing in November. That is not something I'm afraid of. That is a communal decision we will make as a community. And if that is the answer, then that is the answer. And then we take a different set of decisions and a different process, will ensue afterwards. We shouldn't be afraid of anything failing in November. We should be actually feeling empowered that our community is being invited to vote on a very important and significant issue this year. And I would say that many communities are ready, that for many of our residents, our voters, and our constituents, they are looking at us as this is overdue. This is delayed. What has taken you so long to get here? And that is actually a lot of the messages that I get as the chair of public safety, who again was deeply, steeped in reformist initiatives until I realized that, that system is not redeemable. We have to totally undo it and start building a different future.
Thank you. I'm going to say we're done for tonight. People can follow up as they see fit with individual council members, or our work group can go ahead and ask a more formal list of questions later if we have follow-up. This is it for our business tonight. Our next meeting is a public hearing, which is July 15th, a week from tonight at 5 p.m. to receive public comment on the proposed amendment. That'll be a virtual meeting as well. So with no further business before us tonight, I'd like to thank the council members for attending and answering questions. And we are adjourned. Thank you.